When nations face their darkest hours, they all reach for the same forbidden solution. It doesn't matter if they're ancient empires or modern superpowers. It doesn't matter if their leaders are kings, presidents, or dictators. When the walls start closing in, when debts pile up, when wars demand funding, they all make the same fatal choice. They fire up the printing presses, and every single time, the result is catastrophic. Tonight, we're diving into 3 moments in history when entire civilizations thought they could cheat reality by creating money out of thin air. What you're about to see isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for destruction that keeps repeating, and the warning signs are flashing brighter than ever before. The pattern is always identical. First comes the crisis, political eggs, economic collapse, wars, government needs upheaval. The treasury money, but the is empty. Raising taxes triggers rebellion. Borrowing has limits, so they discover what seems like magic. Print more currency, create wealth from nothing. Problem solved, right? Wrong, because what follows is always the same nightmare sequence. Prices explode, savings evaporate, society fractures, and empires that once ruled the world crumble into dust. The money they thought would save them becomes the poison that kills them. Here's what makes this terrifying. Every leader who walks this path believes they're different. They think their situation is unique, their economists are smarter, their system is stronger. They watch other nations collapse and tell themselves, that could never happen to us. Until it does. We're going to examine 3 civilizations that learned this lesson the hard way. Ancient Rome, where emperors discovered they could dilute silver coins to fund endless wars. Weimar Germany, where a desperate government printed marks by the billions to pay impossible debts. And modern Zimbabwe, where leaders turned a prosperous nation into an economic wasteland in less than a decade. Each story follows the same arc. Each empire thought it had found the secret to unlimited wealth, and each one paid the ultimate price when reality came crashing down. But this isn't just about the past. The same forces are at work today, and the stakes have never been higher. Because when the next collapse comes, it won't be confined to a single empire or nation. It will ripple across the entire globe. Let's start with the granddaddy of all monetary disasters. Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or political corruption. Those were symptoms. The real killer was hidden in plain sight, in every coin that changed hands across the empire. For centuries, Rome's economic backbone was the denarius, a silver coin so trusted that merchants from Britain to Egypt accepted it without question. Nearly pure silver, minted with precision, backed by the full faith of the most powerful empire on earth. Roman soldiers earned their pay in denarii, merchants stored their wealth in them, citizens saved for retirement, bayarding chests full of gleaming silver. But running an empire costs money, massive amounts of money. Legions stationed on distant frontiers demanded regular pay. Roads, aqueducts, and forums required constant maintenance. And Rome was always at war somewhere. Germania, Parthia, Britannia, rebellions in Gaul. Every campaign drained the treasury. By the 2nd century, the mathematics were becoming impossible. Tax revenues couldn't keep pace with military expenses. Citizens were already stretched thin, and raising taxes further risked revolt. Borrowing had limits in a world without central banks or bond markets, so the emperors discovered what they thought was genius. Instead of admitting they were broke, they quietly reduced the silver content in each denarius. Not enough for people to notice immediately, but enough to stretch their precious metal reserves. They could mint more coins using the same amount of silver. More coins meant more purchasing power for the government. Crisis solved. The numbers tell the story of this slow-motion catastrophe. Under Augustus, who ruled at the dawn of the empire, the denarius contained 95% pure silver. Citizens could bite the coin and taste the metal. They could feel its weight in their hands. It was real wealth you could hold, but each successive emperor shaved a little more. By the early 3rd century, under Emperor Caracalla, silver content had dropped to 50%. The coins still looked the same, still bore the imperial seal, still carried the weight of Roman authority, but half the value had vanished into thin air. The slide accelerated. By the reign of Gallienus in the mid-3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. What had once been a solid silver coin was now bronze with a thin silver wash. Citizens could scratch the surface and watch the silver flake away, revealing the cheap metal underneath. People aren't stupid. They could see what was happening. The coins felt lighter. They looked different. Merchants started weighing them, testing them, rejecting the obviously debased ones. Inflation followed like a shadow. Prices rose because the money itself was becoming worthless. A measure of wheat that once cost 1 denarius suddenly required 2, then 5, then 10. Not because wheat was scarce, but because the coins were hollow. This wasn't abstract economic theory. It was families watching their savings disappear, soldiers discovering their pay couldn't buy food, merchants abandoning Roman currency altogether. The more confidence eroded, the more desperately emperors debased the currency. They needed volume to replace value. If each coin was worth less, they'd mint more coins. If people doubted the silver content, they'd flood the market with bronze disguised as precious metal. This created the vicious cycle that has repeated in every hyperinflation since. Less valuable money required more money to buy the same goods. More money printing made each unit less valuable. Citizens lost faith in the currency and demanded payment in goods, gold, or foreign coins. The government responded by printing even more, accelerating the collapse. Local economies reverted to barter. Farmers traded grain directly for tools. Craftsmen exchanged pottery for clothing. The sophisticated monetary system that had bound the empire together was fracturing into primitive exchanges. Roman civilization was literally falling apart, one debased coin at a time. But the real catastrophe was yet to come, because when your money becomes worthless, everything else starts unraveling too. Soldiers couldn't be paid, so they mutinied or switched sides. Tax collectors found their revenues worthless before they could deliver them to Rome. Provincial governors discovered they were ruling over territories that contributed nothing to imperial finances. The crisis peaked during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire endured 50 years of chaos. Nearly 50 emperors rose and fell, most assassinated within months of taking power. Plague swept the provinces. Barbarian tribes pressed the borders. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for control. Behind all the political drama was a simple truth. The money was broken, so everything else broke too. You can't run an empire on worthless coins any more than you can build a house on quicksand. The foundation had rotted away, and the superstructure was collapsing. Emperor Diocletian tried to stop the bleeding with price controls. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing the cost of over 1,000 goods and services. Violators faced death. The edict was a disaster. You can't decree that worthless money has value any more than you can order the sun to stop shining. The black market exploded. Official trade collapsed. People learned that the law couldn't make broken money whole. Eventually, Rome abandoned the denarius altogether and introduced the gold solidus under Constantine. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The Western Empire was hollow, sustained only by momentum and the memory of past greatness. This is the first lesson history teaches us about money printing. It always starts with a crisis that seems to justify extraordinary measures. It always begins with leaders who believe they can manage the process, control the outcome, and avoid the fate of their predecessors. And it always ends the same way. The Roman collapse should have been a warning that echoed through history. Instead, it became a blueprint that every desperate government would eventually follow. Fast forward 16 centuries to a defeated Germany in 1918, and watch the pattern repeat with terrifying precision. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end World War I, it sentenced Germany to financial death. The Allied powers demanded reparations so massive they defied comprehension. 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly $400 billion today. To put that in perspective, it was more than Germany's entire gross domestic product. The victors wanted Germany to pay for the entire war, plus interest, for the next 60 years. The German government faced an impossible choice. They could refuse to pay and face military occupation by French and British forces. They could raise taxes to levels that would trigger revolution. They could borrow money they had no hope of repaying. Or they could do what governments always do when backed into a corner. They could print their way out of trouble. At first, it seemed reasonable. The Reichsbank began issuing new marks to meet reparation payments. Just temporary measures, they assured the public, just enough to get through the crisis. The printing presses started slowly, cautiously. A few billion marks here, a few billion there. Nothing that couldn't be managed. But debt has its own gravity. Once you start printing money to pay obligations, you can never print enough. Each payment required more marks. Each new batch of currency made the existing money less valuable. And as the mark weakened, Germany needed even more of them to buy the gold and foreign currency demanded by the Allies. By 1922, the printing presses were running day and night. The Reichsbank employed entire shifts of workers just to operate the machines that created new money. Printing companies across Germany were contracted to help with the workload. The government was literally manufacturing currency faster than they could count it. The numbers became surreal. In January 1922, one American dollar bought 300 German marks. By July, it bought 800. By December, it bought 7,000. The mark wasn't just falling, it was in free fall, accelerating toward oblivion. Workers began demanding payment twice a day because their morning wages were worthless by evening. Restaurants changed their menus hourly as food costs soared. Shopkeepers gave up printing new price tags and simply wrote numbers on chalkboards, erasing and updating them throughout the day. But the real insanity was still to come. In 1923, hyperinflation reached levels that sound like fiction. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded exponentially. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost 12 marks in 1921. By mid-1923, that same loaf cost over 3,000 marks. By September, it cost 2 million marks. By November, it cost over 200 billion marks. Citizens needed wheelbarrows to carry enough cash for basic purchases. Children played with stacks of worthless bills because they were more abundant than toys. People wallpapered their homes with currency because it was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper. The German mark had become a cruel joke, a symbol of national humiliation printed on increasingly worthless paper. The human cost was devastating. Life savings accumulated over decades vanished overnight. Pensioners who had worked their entire lives found themselves destitute. The middle class, the backbone of German society, was wiped out completely. Their bank accounts, insurance policies, and government bonds became meaningless numbers on worthless paper. Meanwhile, those who understood what was happening protected themselves. The wealthy converted marks into foreign currency, gold, or real estate. Factory owners paid off their debts with worthless paper and emerged from hyperinflation, debt-free and asset-rich. International speculators bought German companies for the price of a meal. This created a brutal transfer of wealth from savers to debtors, from the middle class to the elite, from ordinary Germans to foreign investors. Hyperinflation didn't just destroy money, it destroyed the social fabric that held the nation together. Trust evaporated, traditional values crumbled, the promise that hard work and saving would be rewarded became a lie that everyone could see. Political extremism filled the vacuum left by economic collapse. When people lose everything they've worked for, when their government destroys their savings through monetary manipulation, they become desperate for someone to blame. They become willing to listen to radical solutions from radical leaders. The Nazi Party's membership exploded during the hyperinflation crisis. Adolf Hitler's attempted coup in Munich occurred in November 1923 at the exact peak of the monetary collapse. It failed, but the seeds were planted. When people's money becomes worthless, they start looking for scapegoats and strongmen. Democracy becomes a luxury they can no longer afford. Germany eventually stabilized by introducing a new currency backed by land and gold. The hyperinflation ended as suddenly as it had begun, but the damage was permanent. An entire generation had learned that governments lie about money, that savings are fragile, that democracy offers no protection against financial destruction. This lesson would echo through German politics for decades. It would influence their response to the next crisis in the 1930s. It would shape their approach to monetary policy after World War II. The trauma of watching money become meaningless doesn't fade quickly. It becomes embedded in the national psyche, a scar that never fully heals. Yet somehow, the world didn't learn from Germany's agony. The same mistake would be repeated again and again, in different countries, different decades, different circumstances. Because when crisis strikes, when governments face impossible choices, the temptation to print money becomes irresistible. The third act of our monetary tragedy takes place not in ancient Rome or war-torn Europe, but in modern Africa. Zimbabwe, in the year 2000, was a functioning nation with a stable currency, productive agriculture, and a growing economy. 20 years later, it had become synonymous with hyperinflation so severe that children used trillion-dollar notes as play money. This wasn't ancient history or wartime desperation. This was the 21st century, with all our supposed understanding of economics and monetary policy. Yet Zimbabwe managed to destroy its currency so thoroughly that the government eventually abandoned it altogether, adopting foreign currencies just to function. The collapse began with land redistribution policies that decimated agricultural production. Zimbabwe had been the breadbasket of southern Africa, exporting food across the continent. But political decisions destroyed the farming sector almost overnight. Food production plummeted, export revenues vanished. The government found itself facing budget shortfalls that grew larger every month. Sound familiar? Crisis, empty treasury, desperate government? The same setup that had destroyed Rome and Germany was playing out again. And once again, leaders convinced themselves they were different, that their situation was unique, that printing money would solve their problems rather than create new ones. President Robert Mugabe's government began printing Zimbabwe dollars to cover budget deficits. At first, the amounts seemed manageable. A few billion here, a few billion there, just enough to keep government services running, to pay civil servants, to maintain the facade of a functioning state. But printing money to cover deficits is like drinking seawater to cure thirst. It provides temporary relief while making the underlying problem worse. Each new batch of currency diluted the value of existing money. As prices rose, the government needed even more money to buy the same goods and services. The printing presses accelerated. By 2003, inflation had reached triple digits. By 2006, it exceeded 1,000% annually. By 2008, Zimbabwe was experiencing hyperinflation so severe that economists struggled to measure it accurately. The official inflation rate peaked at an incomprehensible 89 sextillion%. That's a number with 21 zeros after it. The pattern never changes, only the names and the dates. Rome's emperors thought they could stretch silver forever. German politicians believed they could print their way out of Versailles. Zimbabwe's leaders convinced themselves they were building a new economy. Every time, the story ends the same way. The money dies, the people suffer, and empires crumble into dust. What makes this terrifying today is the scale. Rome's collapse was regional. Germany's hyperinflation was national. Zimbabwe's disaster was local. But now we live in a world where every major economy runs on paper currencies backed by nothing but promises. Central banks coordinate their money printing. Debts are measured in trillions, not millions. When the next monetary collapse comes, it won't be confined to one empire or one continent. It will be global. The warning signs are flashing everywhere. Governments printing trillions during every crisis. Debt levels that would have horrified previous generations. Inflation creeping back after decades of stability. The same desperation, the same justifications, the same belief that this time is different. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its lessons, it will crush you all the same. The empires we've examined tonight all made the same fatal mistake. They confused paper with wealth, promises with value, printing with prosperity, and every one of them paid the ultimate price. The question isn't whether the next monetary collapse will happen, the question is whether you'll be ready when it does. If this opened your eyes to the patterns that shape our world, hit subscribe. History has all the answers, you just have to know where to look.